Peace be with you, and a happy and blessed Easter to you. This is the great day. This is the day of days. Everything else in Christian life flows from the resurrection of Jesus and flows back to it. This is the cornerstone. This is the anchor. This is everything in Christian life. I've often said, when the first Christians came to preach, this is what they preached: Jesus risen from the dead. Every church ever built in the Christian world centers around Jesus risen from the dead. Every proclamation of any preacher, theologian, teacher returns to and is based upon this claim that Jesus is risen from the dead. Easter is our day. Easter is the great day. And the church asks us every Easter Sunday to meditate upon this magnificent passage in the 20th chapter of John's Gospel. Listen to how it begins. Early in the morning, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. She saw that the stone had been moved away. There are many parallels between the Gospel of John and the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The prologue to John's Gospel says, "In the beginning was the Word, and through that Word all things were made." Furthermore, the book of Genesis says that God separates light from darkness. "Let there be light," the Creator God says, and there is light. In the prologue to John's Gospel, it says that Jesus is the light that no darkness can overcome. Throughout the Gospel of John, we see the theme of Jesus as the recreator of a world that had gone wrong through sin. Jesus repeating and recapitulating the great creative work of the God described in Genesis. So here, early in the morning, on the first day of the week, we're at the beginning. It's still dark, John tells us, like it was before the creation of light. And God said in Genesis, "Let there be light." And now a light is going to shine. The light of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, which is the recreation of the world. New life, new direction. We have been moving in one direction, now we're moving back the other way. All that is hinted at in this opening line. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. She saw that the stone had been rolled away. The stone. So Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, placed on a shelf within this tomb, and then a great stone is rolled across to keep the animals and robbers and so on out. This mighty stone would take several men to move it in place. What does it stand for? It stands for the finality of death. This great stone that nobody could move. Death is final. It's absolute. It's the end. When somebody dies, when a loved one dies, the reason we grieve is that we have this deep conviction that we will never see them again. That somehow a barrier has been established that we cannot cross. It's as though a stone has been rolled across, blocking us permanently from this person. The stone stands, if you will, not just for grief, but it stands for this existential frustration that we feel in the presence of death. And so, it's been moved. Symbolically here we have the whole statement of resurrection faith. The barrier separating us, the barrier of death, the terrible finality of it, has been removed. What's Mary Magdalene's first impression? Undoubtedly that grave robbers had been at work. The beautiful irony of John's Gospel is, yes, a grave robber has been at work. The grave robber who is Almighty God. In the book of the prophet Ezekiel, God says, "I will open your graves and have you rise from them." That was a great Old Testament hope It was a promise. Now, on Easter Sunday morning, it becomes an accomplished fact. God opens our graves and He has us rise from them. He rolls back the stone, symbolizing the terrible facticity of death. Yes, the great grave robber has been at work. She runs and tells the disciples, especially Peter and John. And Peter and John run to the tomb, John arriving first. He looks in and he sees the burial cloths. Then Peter arrives, huffing and puffing a little bit later. He looks in the tomb, sees the same thing, the burial cloths. Listen now how it's described. He did not enter, but bent down to peer in, and saw the wrappings lying on the ground. Presently, Simon Peter came along behind him, and he entered the tomb. He observed the wrappings on the ground, and saw the piece of cloth which had covered the head, not lying with the other wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Now, Christians, why is this man telling us about the burial wrappings? Why this odd detail? He's about to proclaim resurrection faith, and now we have these two people noticing the burial wrappings of Jesus. First of all, to me, it signals the eyewitness quality of this story. It's one of those odd, quirky details that comes up when you are telling a true story. But secondly, and more importantly, and it's clearer actually in the Greek than in the English, they're noticing the odd way that these cloths are lying. If a grave robber had come, and that was probably their first suspicion, a grave robber has taken the body of Jesus. First of all, why would he bother unwrapping the body? Wouldn't he just spirit it away? But secondly, even if he had unwrapped the body, wouldn't he simply have tossed the burial cloths to the side? Wouldn't they have just been in a sort of unkempt position on the floor? The implication of this story is that the burial cloths were lying undisturbed. And the napkin that had been around his head was rolled up neatly and placed in another place. When they see this, they believe. What did they see? They saw this peculiar quality of the burial cloths that seemed to suggest that the body of Jesus had not been taken away, had not been extricated from these cloths, but that the body of Jesus had passed through them. As later he will pass through the walls of the place where they were. Something about these cloths began to signal to them what had happened. Let me put it one step further. It is an indisputable fact that in these great Easter stories, what's being witnessed to is the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Now, mind you, not simply the resuscitation of a corpse, like the resuscitation of Lazarus. Nevertheless, a bodily resurrection. We mean these stories aren't just nice literary symbols that point to the fact that Jesus has gone to be with God. They're not just symbolic accounts detailing the fact that the cause of Jesus goes on. Not just ways of talking about how Jesus continues to inspire his followers. Yes, that's precisely what I mean. It means none of that. It means none of that. What's being declared here is that Jesus rose bodily from the dead and is living a new and transformed life, making that life available to us, his followers. Christians, you can sense it on every page of the New Testament. Look, if all they meant by the resurrection was his cause goes on, or it's another concocted myth of a dying and rising God, if that's all they meant, nobody would have taken them seriously. And their excitement would not come through on every page of the New Testament, because they would have just been saying some old story. Instead, what we hear is the fact that they were bowled over by something entirely new, something entirely unexpected. New life, a new embodied life made possible through God's grace. Somehow, everything they'd ever thought about the world had to be rethought. Everything they'd ever imagined as basic had to be reimagined. Every road they'd walked down, they had to walk down a new way in light of this startling fact of Jesus risen bodily from the dead. We can hear it in our first reading, which is one of Peter's great sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. Listen to what he says. They killed him finally, hanging him on a tree, only to have God raise him up on the third day, and grant that he be seen, not by all, but only by such witnesses as have been chosen beforehand by God, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. How come the risen Jesus appeared only to a few? Peter says it here. He didn't appear to everyone. The risen Christ did not appear on the top of the Mount of Olives and make himself universally available. He didn't appear to Pontius Pilate, didn't appear to Herod, didn't appear to all of his persecutors. How come Jesus appeared only to some, only to a few? John Henry Newman's answer, I think, is wonderful. Newman said it's because he appeared for the sake of mission. He wanted this news to go to the ends of the world, as indeed it has. If he had appeared universally to everybody, what would have happened? Oh, some would have been interested, some not. Some would have gotten it, some wouldn't have. Some would have been inspired and then have lost faith. But he appeared to a small coterie who knew him, who loved him, who had listened to him, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He appeared to that small group because he wanted to announce his word to the world. And that announcement would happen through the punchy and clear quality of this small group. Mission was his purpose. So Christians, on this Easter Sunday, let us be aware of the fact that Jesus is giving us the same mission. We who eat and drink with him on a regular basis, whenever we gather for the liturgy, we're eating and drinking with the risen Christ. He appears to us, so to speak, for the same purpose, that we might be galvanized in this mission to announce this startling fact, Jesus risen from the dead, which changes everything. Changes the way you think, live, see, act, changes the hope that you have for this embodied and transformed spiritual life on high. Announce it today. Announce it for the rest of your life. That's the call of Easter. And God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, we're reading during the second half of the Easter season from this extraordinary text in the Gospel of John. I mean the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th chapters. Not that we read all of that business, we don't, but we read from it. These chapters constitute what's called Jesus' Last Supper discourse. You know, in the Gospel of John, we don't have an institution narrative, which is to say, we don't have an account of Jesus blessing the bread and the cup and so on. That's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John, what we have the night before he dies is a lengthy discourse. Why is this important? This is the night before Jesus dies. This is, if you will, his last will and testament. Jesus telling his followers what he wants them to know. Imagine some hero of yours, someone that you admire, and it's the night before he dies, and he's taking the time to tell you what's on his heart. Well, you'd listen pretty carefully, which is why the church in these weeks after Easter spends so much time with this Last Supper discourse of Jesus. We need, as a church, to listen to what he says. So, the gospel for today includes one of the most beautiful, provocative, challenging images in the gospel. Listen to the Lord now. Jesus said to his disciples, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He prunes away every barren branch, but the fruitful ones he trims clean to increase their yield. Live on in me as I do in you." Jesus is the vine. We are the branches. Jesus is the source of our life, and we are grafted onto him. You know, the author of the Gospel of John loves organic images. "Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no life in you. I am the bread of life," Jesus says. Organic, life images. What we need to survive. Something tells me whoever wrote the Gospel of John at some point in his life was probably a farmer or someone that worked close to the earth. That's where this imagery comes from. That great word he often uses, and I've made reference to it before, menein. It's the Greek word for to remain. Unless you remain in me, there's no life in you. Jesus says in John's Gospel, "I remain in the Father. I draw my life from him." Just as a plant has to remain in the ground, it has to be rooted in the ground for it to live. Just as a fish has to remain in the ocean or it will die. Just as we have to remain in this atmosphere filled with oxygen if we're going to survive. This is what St. John means in regard to our relationship to Jesus. Jesus Christ is not simply for us a teacher of inspiring words. He is that, but not only that. He's not only a great moral example whom we should follow. He is that, but not only that. Jesus is our life. He's the vine. We are the branches. Which is why, of course, John's image here is closely related to Paul's image of the church as a body. The church is not just a collectivity of like-minded people, like a club. Nothing wrong with clubs, but the church is much more than that. The church is a living organism made up of interdependent cells and organs and molecules, living in an interdependent way. Christ is the head, we are the members. Very similar now to John's image, the vine and the branches, the one in whom we have life. Now, what's the implication of all this? Listen again to the Lord. "No more than a branch can bear fruit of itself apart from the vine, can you bear fruit apart from me." What could be clearer? What could be less ambiguous? You want to bear fruit? This means in the supernatural life. This means in the life of God. You want to bear fruit. Remain grafted onto Jesus Christ. You're not grafted onto him? You're remaining somewhere else, drawing your life from some other source? Okay, you won't bear fruit. It's as simple as that. Does this strike us as a little bit overbearing? Maybe a little bit arrogant? How can someone impose this teaching on me? Can I suggest a comparison? I think in our culture we are very comfortable with doctors, dietitians, trainers, telling us exactly what we must do to maintain our physical health. You go to a doctor, and he says, well, you have to eat a balanced diet, you have to eat nutritious food, you got to cut fat and cholesterol, salt out of your diet, you've got to exercise, you have to stop smoking, stop drinking. Why? Well, that's just the way the body's built. the doctor knows how the body is built and how it functions. And if you do all those things, those negative things, your body simply isn't going to live. If you exaggerate those misbehaviors, you will die. Suppose you come to the doctor and you say, well, you know, for breakfast I have waffles and butter and syrup and sausage. For lunch I have a Big Mac and fries. For dinner I eat lasagna and I have a big dessert with whipped cream. I never exercise. I smoke 2 packs a day. I drink. He'd say, well, you're killing yourself. And what if I were to say, doctor, how dare you tell me I'm killing myself? How dare you impose another vision of life on me? He'd say, well, I'm just telling you the facts. I'm not imposing something on you arbitrarily. I'm telling you how the body functions. What makes it flourish? What makes it sick? Take my advice or not, I'm just laying out the facts. Suppose a trainer says to you, now here are the exercises you have to do every day. Your aerobic exercise, weightlifting, whatever it is, he tells you, here's the program. You want to get fit? This is what you must do. Would I say, well, how dare you impose this vision on me? How dare you make these expectations? You say, well, take it or leave it. I'm just telling you what makes the body thrive. So, Christians, here, Jesus is not giving us some arbitrary imposition. He's not laying a burden on us. He's laying out the facts. Just as the body functions in a certain way, flourishes under certain conditions, so the soul, so the spirit works in a certain way, flourishes under certain conditions. This is what it means to be grafted onto Christ. And if we are not grafted onto Christ, we will wither away. We will bear no fruit. That's not an arbitrary decision. That's a statement of fact. Now, what does it mean concretely to be grafted onto Christ? To find our life in Him? Let me just mention now in the remaining minutes a few things. I think it means at the most basic level that you are a follower of the Ten Commandments. Remember when the rich young man comes to Jesus and says, Lord, what must I do to attain eternal life? The first thing Jesus says to him is, well, you know the commandments. And then he enumerates them for him. Okay, that's the basics. That's the fundamental. It's like the building block of a healthy body. So the building block, the cornerstone of a healthy soul, is the moral life. Following the commandments, honoring God, loving neighbor, not lying, not cheating, not coveting. Okay. To say that, well, I just ignore the Ten Commandments, but I'm basically fine spiritually. It's like saying, I eat all these lousy foods, but I'm fine physically. Doesn't work. What else does it mean? Being grafted onto Christ. I think it means a steady participation in the life of prayer. Prayer is conversation with God, opening one's heart to God. To do it not once in a while. That's like saying, well, I exercise every once in a while, once every 6 months. Well, that won't do you much good. To pray on a regular basis, to pray on a daily basis, to open your heart to the Lord. That's remaining grafted onto Him. Immersing yourself in the sacred Scriptures. Again, not once in a while, on a regular basis. Read the Bible. More to it, listen to homilies and interpretations as people try to explain the Scripture. But let that be a kind of ocean in which you swim, a world of meaning in which you remain and abide. That's part of what it means to be grafted onto Christ. What else does it mean? I think it means practicing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. I know I've spoken to you about those before. Feed the hungry. Give drink to the thirsty. Clothe the naked. Visit the imprisoned. Pray for the living and the dead. Comfort the afflicted, etc. In other words, very concrete ways in which you participate in the very to-be of Jesus. You live as He lives. think as he thinks, act as he acts. Lord, when did we see you naked or hungry or alone and not attend to your needs? Every time you fail to do it to one of these least of mine. Doing the corporal and spiritual works is being grafted onto Christ. What else? Participating in the sacraments of the church. Christians, what are the sacraments? But routes of access to the life of Jesus, where the life of Jesus is made available to us. I'm the vine, you're the branches. The sacraments are these life sources. I would say especially confession and the Eucharist. J.R.R. Tolkien, the great author of The Lord of the Rings, wrote a letter to his son. His son's faith was wavering, and he wrote to his dad and said, "It's just bothering me that I'm starting to lose my faith." Tolkien said to him, "The first thing you must do, you must stay close to the Eucharist. That's where the life of Christ is found." You know what concerns me a little bit in the wake of the priest crisis that we've been experiencing? I think too many priests stopped going to confession. I know it's a complex matter. There are all kinds of reasons for the crisis, but I think one of them is too many priests stopped going to confession. One of the ways that we have access to Christ. Let me close with this. Some people are lucky in that they are naturally healthy. They don't have to do a lot of exercise, a lot of dieting. They're naturally healthy. But listen, nobody is naturally supernatural. So one thing we can't be naturally is supernatural. You want the supernatural life of Christ in you, you must remain grafted onto the vine in all these ways I've specified. Stay close to the fire. Stay close to the source of life. God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, the thing about Jesus is he tends to cause trouble. We can see this in all four of the Gospels. Whenever Jesus speaks or acts, especially in a decisive way, he tends to awaken in his followers and those who hear him an opposition. Of course, all the Gospels move toward this climactic point of the cross, when everyone comes after him. Today we finish our reading of this Bread of Life discourse from the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. Jesus presenting to us in great detail, rich theological detail, the meaning of the Eucharist. We shouldn't be surprised, therefore, that at the end of this discourse, what he awakens is opposition. Listen, many of the disciples of Jesus remarked, "This sort of talk is hard to endure. How can anyone take it seriously?" And then toward the end, from this time on, many of his disciples broke away and would not remain in his company any longer. I said last week that in laying out this densely textured picture of the Eucharist, Jesus presents to us the Christian thing. We see this way of being, this way of life that is Christianity. And because it's so vividly presented, the opposition is especially strong to it. Last week I mentioned there were three things that emerge with great clarity in this presentation. First of all, Christianity has to do with him, with Jesus. Not his teaching primarily, but with him. Secondly, it has to do with a God who becomes flesh. Thirdly, it has to do with the law of the gift. All three are difficult to take. All three awaken opposition, and therefore, Christians, all three call for a decision on our part. That's what's so powerful here. At the end of this process, the end of this presentation, Jesus will say to his disciples, well, they've all left. What do you say? What will you do? And so we, as we hear this presentation, we are compelled to make a decision. Are we for him or are we against him? Let me look just briefly again at these three things and point out why they awaken such opposition. First of all, that it's about him. Wouldn't it be easier just to say, Jesus is one more compelling and beautiful spiritual teacher? There are a lot of them, from the Buddha, Hindu masters, from Muhammad, Jewish mystics and teachers. Why couldn't Jesus just be one of them? One like them. And so that, I'm intrigued by what he says. But that I have to be related to him in a personal and exclusive way, it just seems counterintuitive. What do I say? All those other teachers just have nothing to say? Why would Jesus have to make this enormous, exclusive, and personal demand on me? It just doesn't seem reasonable. How about we get at it this way? Look at it not from our side, but from Jesus' side. The Lord Jesus Christ offers us friendship. I no longer call you servants, but friends, says the Lord at the Last Supper. Friendship. Friendship. I want you to stay with me. I want to be in your company. I want you to be in my company. I want a relationship with you. That's what Jesus says. And in that relationship, we become the friends of God. That's the heart of the Christian thing. Now, suppose there were someone in your life who was offering you friendship. They wanted to be friends, and they were offering you this relationship. And you were to say to them, I think you're great. I like what you stand for. I like your ideas. But I don't really want to be your friend. I want to listen to a lot of other people and hang out with a lot of other people. Well, would that be satisfying to this prospective friend? No. And so if we say to Jesus, I know you're offering me friendship, but hey, I'm just interested in your ideas. That's not what he wants. That's not what he's offering. He's offering much more than that. Intimacy with him. I think a second reason why this is so difficult, it makes such a demand on us. If someone's your friend, and you say, well, I spend, an hour a year with him or with her. Once every couple of years we talk on the phone. Well, that's not your friend. A friend is someone who can legitimately demand from you time and attention. So if Jesus Christ is saying, I want friendship with you, what he's saying is, I want your time and attention. And in fact, I demand it. I want you to be an intimate part of my life, and so I must be an intimate part of your life. I want your time and attention, in fact, in a central way. Hey, I much prefer to keep Jesus at arm's length. I would much prefer to listen from time to time to his teaching, maybe to find him inspiring in a vague way, but friendship, that makes a big personal demand on me. Yep, it does. Which is why we find it so hard. Which is why they say, and we say, this kind of talk is hard to endure. There was a second thing I pointed out last week that I think becomes clear in this discourse. That the Word became flesh. That God became one of us. God took to himself a nature like ours, an animal body, muscle and nerves is ordinary stuff. God became flesh. I mentioned last week that from the beginning of Christianity, this teaching has been opposed. The Docetus early on, that word comes from the Greek word dokein, by the way, which means to appear. The Docetus said, no, God just appears to be human. He's not really enfleshed. How could God become a grubby creature? And in the last couple of centuries, modern liberals have said, no, Jesus is a great spiritual teacher, a great ethical example, but not God made flesh. Why, up and down the centuries, have we resisted the claim that God becomes a creature? Well, I think it has a lot to do with flesh, and I mean now our flesh. Unless you, we saw last week, consume my body and drink my blood, unless you gnaw on my flesh, in that almost gross term in the Greek, and drink my blood, you have no life in you. If God becomes flesh, and we're meant to consume Him, we're meant to eat His body and drink His blood, that means we become conformed to Him. And Christians, that means, listen, God now gets into my flesh. My ordinary life. My sexual life, my physical life, my life of recreation, play, everything I do with my body. I'm drawing Jesus Christ into that world. I am much happier keeping Him at a distance. I'd be much happier. God's in His heaven, in His spiritual place. Here I am now in my grubby physicality. But see, I'm happier with that. I'm happier with that because now God is not invading my flesh. But the Eucharist, the Incarnation says, yes, He does. Yes, He does. I can't just say, here's the material world, there's the spiritual world. The spiritual world has invaded the material world. And when I eat His body and drink His blood, I allow His flesh to invade my flesh. Better, my flesh to be assimilated to His. I'm, as a sinner, much happier with a distant God. This fleshy God is too close. This God who insists on getting into every nook and cranny of my life, I kind of prefer to keep at a distance. I know I've spoken before about the lordship of Jesus. Jesus is the Lord. That means He's the commander of everything in my life. Intellectual, yes. Spiritual, yes. Physical, yes. He's the Lord of that too, because the Word became flesh. Third great truth that emerges from this discourse, the law of the gift. I said it last week. Your being increases in the measure that you give it away. Life is not about hoarding things for the ego, drawing the world into me. That's the way of the sinner. The way of the saint, embodied fully in Christ, is that my being increases as I give it away. Friends, why were the ancient gods so popular? All those gods of ancient Greece and Rome. Well, they were like us. Read those stories of the gods. The gods were immortal, the gods had great powers, and so on. But spiritually, psychologically, they were a lot like us. Vain, self-absorbed, jealous, violent. They didn't make much of a moral demand on us. Oh, be like the gods. Fine, I'd like to be like the gods. They're like me at my worst moments. They weren't much of a challenge. But then there's this. The Word becomes flesh, dwells among us, and shows us that God is nothing but self-offering love. God says, eat my body and drink my blood. God says, my whole being is to be for you. Hey, wait. Now that God does make a moral demand on me. Because boy, oh boy, do I realize my life is not like that. As I survey my own life, I say, almost every waking moment, I'm thinking about ways to aggrandize myself. The true God says, my whole being is to give myself away. Confronting that God is not easy. And that's why I find this kind of talk hard to endure. Jesus turns to the 12 as a lot of His disciples leave. And He says, so, Do you want to leave me too? That's the question we hear at the end of this bread of life discourse. That's the question we hear. It's about Him personally. It's about a God who is made flesh and enters into our flesh. It's about the God of the gift. Do you want to enter into this beautiful and compelling world? Or is it too much? That's the decision prompted by the Eucharist. God bless you.
Peace be with you. Friends, we know this scene well. Jesus, in the area of Caesarea Philippi, asked His disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" After they report the common consensus, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets, Peter speaks up. "You are the Christ." Now, what precisely would a first-century Jew have meant by this title, Christ? We read it, of course, through the lens of 2,000 years of theological speculation. Peter would have said in his Aramaic, "You are the Mashiach, the Anointed One." That Hebrew Aramaic term Mashiach was rendered in Greek as Christos, hence our word Christ comes from it. Well, who was the Mashiach? What would someone like Peter have meant by it? Well, for centuries, Jews have been waiting for a deliverer in the line of David. Someone who would liberate Israel from its enemies, who would gather the tribes into one great nation again, and who would make Israel a light to the world. That was the Mashiach's job description. Recall the prophet Samuel anointed David when he was a little kid. And the Bible tells us the Spirit of God rushed upon David. That was the moment he became the Mashiach, the Anointed One. David, like Saul before him, and like so many of his successors, was a warrior. He spent almost his whole career battling the enemies of Israel. As the first book of Samuel puts it, slaughtering his tens of thousands. Well, friends, in prophet after prophet, psalm after psalm, we hear the longing for a new David, the definitive David, the warrior king who would unite and liberate his people and bring about the reign of God. That was the Mashiach. That was the Christ. However, in the very midst of the Old Testament, there is a strange description of the Messiah. It's fair to say it's a minority opinion. It's an egregious exception to all of the usual descriptions. We can find it in the 50th through the 53rd chapters of the book of the prophet Isaiah. A bit of this very odd description constitutes our first reading this week. Listen now, as Isaiah the prophet channels, as it were, the words of the Mashiach, the Messiah. Listen. "I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard. My face I did not shield from buffets and spitting." This does not sound like the Davidic Messiah. This does not sound like a warrior king conquering the enemies of Israel, giving his back to those who beat him instead of fighting them, giving his cheeks to those who plucked his beard, not punching them back, not even shielding his face from buffets and spitting. This hardly seems Davidic. And then we hear, of course, in chapter 53, "He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. He was wounded for our offenses, crushed for our iniquities." Again, this does not sound like a Davidic warrior king. Despised, rejected, a man of suffering, None of this sounds like the standard expectation of the Mashiach. But friends, now reading all this from the Christian perspective, we are getting very close to what Hans Urs von Balthasar would call the theologic. God's way of thinking, God's way of imagining, God's way of picturing the world, theologic. In God's logic, in God's speech, things are often not as they appear. Things are often turned upside down. Is the Mashiach a warrior? Yes, but listen in this Isaiah text how he will fight. Not in the usual way. He would fight by becoming a lamb of sacrifice. Now, I said this Isaiah opinion, buried in the middle of the book of the prophet Isaiah, is a minority opinion. That's true. It's egregious, it's strange, it's exceptional. And we can hear the exceptionality of it in Peter's response. Peter says, I think you're the Christ. I think you're the Mashiach. Immediately, Jesus clarifies what this means. Listen. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders and killed. Representing the common attitude. This is not something peculiar to Peter, not his little psychological hang-up, but representing the mainstream opinion of his time. Peter, of course, who had just confessed him, now rebukes him. Boy, that verb is strong. Peter takes him to task, corrects him, remonstrates with him. Yes, you're the Mashiach, you're the Messiah, the Christ. That means powerful, victorious, a military hero, a new Solomon. That's what it means. And again, Peter is in line with the mainstream of his tradition. To be killed, to suffer, to be rejected, all that would be a sign that you were not the Israelite Messiah. But Jesus rebukes him back. And these are, I think, among the most startling, disturbing lines in the whole New Testament. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." Extraordinary, isn't it? Nothing more startling, nothing stranger in the New Testament than those words. Peter himself, who's just confessed correctly who Christ is now rebuked because he had rebuked the Christ. And notice, please, what the Lord says. You're thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. You, Peter, are thinking according to a human logic. But in fact, we must listen. As Isaiah anticipated long ago, we must think theologically, according to God's logic. Okay, what is it? What's the difference? The human way of thinking, as old as the hills, as old as King David, as contemporary as today's headlines, says this: violence should be met with violence. Injustice answered through more injustice. Evil confronted by revenge. That's the way of the world. That's human logic on display. That's the way the Mashiach was imagined to be according to our sinful imagination. But we know from so much painful experience, the Pope, by the way, Benedict XVI, just reiterated this last week. We know from painful experience that such logic simply perpetuates the cycle of violence, deepens existing hatreds, solves no problem. What the true Davidic Messiah shows is a new way of responding to Israel's enemies. Here's the wonderful ironies I've said before. Does Jesus fight the definitive battle? Yes, he does. Does he stare down the enemies of Israel? Yes. But how? By absorbing their hatred in love, forgiveness, compassion, and thereby transforming it. Nailed to the cross, he can say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Jesus absorbs the violence of the enemies of Israel. That means the violence of sin, of the whole world. He absorbs it in his love and his compassion and his nonviolence, and thereby transforms it. He doesn't perpetuate the cycle of violence, but he brings it to an end. He shows, as Isaiah anticipated, how the Mashiach would fight. Oh, an idle dream? No one that's been through the 20th century should ever say that. Lots of powerful people who read these texts of the New Testament and who honored Jesus, the Mashiach, knew the power of these words and of this witness. Martin Luther King, facing down racism, facing down stupidity and violence, did so not with an answering violence, not with an answering injustice, but through nonviolence and through a compassion that absorbed and thereby transformed that hatred. Bishop Tutu, following the exact same method in South Africa, confronted the enemies of God. Yes, he did. But not with the weapons of the world, not with an answering violence or injustice, but did it through compassion, nonviolence, forgiveness. And, as I've often said, John Paul II in Poland in the early 80s practiced this with powerful results, facing down one of the most powerful empires in the history of the human race, and defeated it, not with the weapons of the world, but with the weapons of the true Mashiach, the true Messiah. I saw a videotape just recently about 9/11. As I record these words, we're 2 days after the 5th anniversary of 9/11. The commentator said this very simple but very profound statement. We have to love our way out of this. We can't hate our way out of it. Friends, that's not to be namby-pamby or wishy-washy. That's not to be naive. That's not to be idealistic in a silly way. No, the people that perpetrated 9/11 were wicked people. But the truth remains, the fact remains. We can't hate our way out of it. But following Jesus the Mashiach, the suffering servant who bore the infirmities of the world, who took them on himself and transformed them, following him, we must take up our cross. We must walk in his footsteps. And then we, as Christians, as his followers, become a means by which the cycle of violence and hatred can be broken. There's the power of this text. That's what it means to follow Jesus, the Mashiach, the Christ. And God bless you.